Working the night shift at a fast food joint was never my dream job. In fact, it was far from it. I had a college degree in marketing, but life had a way of pushing you into unexpected corners. And that corner, for me, was the graveyard shift at Friar's Delight. Nestled on the outskirts of town, Friar's Delight was a dingy little place that had seen better days. The flickering neon sign buzzed with an eerie glow, and the peeling paint on the building gave it an abandoned, haunted house vibe. However, I needed the money, and the night shift paid a bit extra, so I reluctantly took the job. My first night on the job was unsettling from the start. The manager, Mr. Johnson, a stout man with greasy hair and a permanent frown, handed me a uniform that smelled like it hadn't been washed in years. He mumbled some instructions, and I was thrust into the kitchen with a crew that seemed to consist entirely of misfits and loners. The restaurant was eerily empty when I arrived, save for a few late-night stragglers. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed loudly, casting long, ominous shadows. As I began my monotonous task of flipping burgers and filling drink cups, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. Around midnight, the first strange incident occurred. As I stood by the deep fryer, dropping French fries into bubbling oil, I heard a faint whisper. It was unintelligible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to look, but the kitchen was empty. I chalked it up to exhaustion and continued working. The night dragged on, and as the clock neared 3 a.m., things got progressively weirder. The intercom system crackled to life, emitting a low, eerie hum. Then, a voice, garbled and distorted, announced, "Welcome to Friar's Delight, where your deepest cravings will be fulfilled." It was like something out of a horror movie. I rushed to the intercom panel to see if someone was playing a prank, but it was turned off. The voice continued, its words growing darker with each announcement. "In the darkest corners of your soul, we find our ingredients. The secrets you hide, we savor in our recipes." I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened, unable to comprehend what was happening. I glanced around the kitchen, and my co-workers wore expressions of fear and confusion. We were all trapped in this bizarre nightmare. The intercom voice grew louder, now almost a menacing growl. "Tonight, we have a special dish, created just for you." And then it listed off our names, one by one, including mine. Panicking, I made a break for the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the entire restaurant had become a prison. The intercom continued. "You can't escape your fate. We've been watching, waiting. Tonight, you become one with Friar's Delight." Terrified, I turned to my co-workers, but they had all frozen in place, their eyes glazed over. It was as if they were under some dark spell. The kitchen was filled with the scent of burning meat and the sound of sizzling fries, but it was no longer the familiar aroma of fast food. It was a sickening, metallic stench. I stumbled back to the fryer, unable to tear my eyes away from it. The bubbling oil now seemed like a portal to hell itself. The whispering voices grew louder, urging me to embrace my fate, to become part of the twisted menu. I could feel something dark and malevolent lurking just beyond my vision, something hungry. In a desperate attempt to break the spell, I grabbed a fire extinguisher and sprayed it wildly, dousing the fryer in white foam. The kitchen erupted in chaos, and my co-workers snapped out of their trance, shrieking and scrambling for the exit. The intercom fell silent, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. We burst through the restaurant doors and spilled out into the parking lot, gasping for breath. The first light of dawn was breaking on the horizon, and Friar's Delight stood before us, looking just as dingy and abandoned as ever. But we knew better now. We had seen the true face of that place. We never went back to Friar's Delight, and we never spoke of that night again. It was a nightmarish ordeal that none of us could explain. To this day, I can't eat fast food without feeling a shiver of dread, and I'm haunted by the memory of that true, scary, and spooky fast food night shift. A night that will forever remain etched in my mind as a disturbing and inexplicable horror. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind of night where you could feel the weight of the shadows pressing down on you. I had taken up a job at the local fast food joint, the Midnight Diner, to make some extra cash. Little did I know that the night shift would turn into a horrifying experience that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The Midnight Diner was a strange place. It had a reputation in town for being open 24/7, but most people avoided it like the plague after dark. It stood on the outskirts of town, isolated and eerie. The neon sign flickered ominously as I arrived for my first night shift. As I entered the diner, the smell of grease and stale coffee filled the air. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance to a silent, malevolent tune. I nervously approached the counter, where the manager, Mr. Johnson, a portly man with a perpetual scowl, handed me my uniform. "Welcome to the Midnight Diner," he grunted. "Don't mess up the orders, and for heaven's sake don't ever venture into the basement, got it?" I nodded, unsure if he was joking or not. The basement was notorious among the employees, a place that no one dared to enter. Rumors of strange noises and ghostly apparitions had circulated for years, but no one had ever dared to investigate. My shift began, and I manned the cash register, taking orders from the few brave souls who ventured into the diner that night. The customers were as odd as the place itself, strange, lonely figures who seemed lost in their thoughts. The minutes ticked away slowly, and the sense of unease that had settled over me grew stronger. As the clock struck midnight, a chill ran down my spine. That's when things started to get truly disturbing. The lights began to flicker, and the low hum of conversation from the customers faded into an eerie silence. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing at the entrance. It was a man, but there was something terribly wrong with him. His clothes were tattered, and his face was pale and gaunt. His eyes were empty sockets, and his mouth hung open, emitting a guttural, unearthly moan. I froze in terror as the man shuffled toward the counter. It was clear that he was not alive, yet he moved with a purpose, as if drawn to the Midnight Diner by some dark force. The other customers had also noticed, and they stared in shock and horror. Mr. Johnson, normally a gruff and unflappable man, looked terrified. He rushed out from behind the counter, grabbed a broom, and swung it at the approaching specter. But the broom passed right through the ghostly figure, as if it were made of air. The ghostly man continued to advance, his moans growing louder and more unsettling. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. Panic gripped me as I realized there was no escape. I was trapped in the Midnight Diner with a malevolent spirit, and there was nowhere to hide. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a voice echoed through the diner. It was a woman's voice, soft and soothing, yet filled with an otherworldly power. "Leave this place," she commanded. The ghostly man hesitated for a moment, his moans faltering. Then, with a final, mournful wail, he disappeared into thin air, leaving behind an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. The lights stopped flickering, and the customers slowly began to regain their composure. Mr. Johnson returned the broom to its place and gave me a solemn look. "You've had your initiation," he said gravely. "Welcome to the Midnight Diner." As the night wore on, I learned more about the sinister history of the place. The Midnight Diner had been built on the site of an old cemetery, and the restless spirits of the deceased were said to haunt the place, especially during the midnight shift. The woman who had saved me from the ghostly man was known as the Midnight Protector. She appeared whenever the malevolent spirits grew too powerful, using her ethereal presence to drive them away. No one knew who she was or where she came from, but she was a guardian of the Midnight Diner, protecting the living from the vengeful dead. My time at the Midnight Diner became a never-ending nightmare. Night after night, I encountered more spirits, each one more terrifying than the last. I saw shadowy figures in the corner of my eye, heard ghostly whispers in the dark, and felt cold, clammy hands brushing against my skin. The Midnight Protector continued to watch over me, but I could tell that even she was growing weary. The malevolent spirits were relentless, and their presence grew stronger with each passing night. One fateful night, as I was closing up the diner, I heard a voice calling to me from the basement. It was a soft, melodic voice that seemed to beckon me with a promise of answers and escape. Against my better judgment, I descended the creaking stairs into the darkness below. What I found in the basement was beyond anything I could have imagined. It was a chamber filled with ancient, dusty books and arcane symbols etched into the walls. At the center of the room stood a sinister-looking altar, covered in candles and strange, otherworldly artifacts. And there, in the dim light, I saw the Midnight Protector, her ethereal form flickering like a dying flame. She turned to me, her eyes filled with sadness and regret. "You were not meant to come here," she said softly. "This is where the malevolent spirits draw their power. They have lured you here to trap you with them." I felt a cold dread wash over me as I realized the truth. I had been deceived by the very spirits I had been trying to escape. The malevolent spirits closed in around me, their moans and wails echoing in the chamber. The Midnight Protector reached out to me, her hand passing through my shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. And then darkness consumed me. I woke up in my own bed the next morning, drenched in sweat and trembling with fear. It had all been a dream, a nightmare that felt so real. But the terror of the Midnight Diner and its malevolent spirits still lingered in my mind. I never went back to that place, and I never will. The Midnight Diner had shown me a world of horror and darkness that I could never forget. And somewhere out there, in the shadowy corners of the night, the Midnight Protector continues her eternal battle against the vengeful spirits that haunt that cursed place. I've always been a night owl, so when I landed a job at the local fast food joint working the graveyard shift, I thought it would be a piece of cake. Little did I know that those long, eerie hours would lead me down a path I could never have imagined. My first night on the job started like any other. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I prepared to serve the late-night crowd their greasy, heart-stopping meals. The manager, Mr. Anderson, was an imposing figure who rarely spoke, but always seemed to be watching. He handed me an apron and a cap before mumbling, "Good luck." As the hours ticked by, I began to notice something strange. Every so often, out of the corner of my eye, I would catch a glimpse of movement in the dimly lit dining area. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the shadows, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Around 2 a.m., a man walked in, looking disheveled and agitated. He approached the counter, his eyes darting around the empty restaurant as if he expected something to leap out at him. He ordered a cheeseburger and fries, his hands trembling as he handed me a crumpled bill. I tried to make small talk, to ease the tension in the air, but he just stared past me, his eyes filled with dread. I handed him his food, and he quickly scurried to a corner booth, hunching over his meal like a man possessed. I watched him from behind the counter, growing more uneasy with each passing moment. He took a bite of his burger and then froze, his eyes widening in terror. He began to gag and cough, clutching at his throat. I rushed over to help, but before I could reach him, he collapsed onto the table, his face turning an unnatural shade of purple. Panicked, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, trying to explain the situation as best as I could. But as I glanced back at the man, I froze in horror. His body was slowly sinking into the booth, as if it were swallowing him whole. The screams of agony that had filled the air only moments before were silenced as he disappeared completely, leaving behind nothing but an empty booth and a half-eaten cheeseburger. The 911 operator's voice brought me back to reality, and I stammered out a barely coherent explanation of what had just transpired. The police arrived within minutes, but when they reviewed the security footage, they found nothing unusual. It was as if the man had simply vanished into thin air. They questioned me extensively, but I had no answers to give them. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that fast food joint. I began to notice more strange occurrences during my shifts. Objects would move on their own, and I would hear whispers in the darkness that I couldn't quite make out. Sometimes, when I was cleaning the dining area, I would feel a cold, clammy hand brush against the back of my neck, causing me to jump in terror. One particularly unsettling night, I was closing up the restaurant when I heard a child's laughter coming from the play area. I knew there was no one else in the building, but the laughter grew louder and more sinister with each passing second. I approached the play area cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I entered the dimly lit room, I saw a shadowy figure darting between the plastic tubes and slides. I called out, my voice trembling, "Is anyone there?" There was no response, but the laughter continued, echoing through the empty play area. I hesitated for a moment before summoning the courage to investigate further. I climbed up into the maze of tubes, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The laughter grew louder, and I could now hear other voices joining in, whispering unintelligible words that sent shivers down my spine. I followed the source of the laughter to a small enclosed space at the top of the play structure, and there, huddled in the corner, was a group of children, their eyes vacant and their skin pallid. They stared at me with empty expressions, their laughter turning into a haunting chorus of giggles that chilled me to the bone. I stumbled back in horror, making my way down the tubes as fast as I could. As I reached the bottom and fled the play area, I glanced back one last time, and the children were gone, vanished into thin air just like the man from that first night. I knew then that I had to get out of that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it would never truly let me go. I quit my job the next day, never looking back. To this day, I can't pass by that fast food joint without feeling a shiver down my spine. I don't know what unholy presence dwells within those walls, but I can't help but wonder if the restless spirits of the night shift still haunt the place,